This is the School of Journalism and Communication presentation series, and we are doing some interdisciplinary work this year. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Mark Johnson. Professor Johnson is in the Department of Philosophy and is the author of many books, most notably with George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, Philosophy in the Flesh. His most recent monographs include The Meaning of the Body, Aesthetics of Human Understanding, Morality for Humans, Ethical Understanding from the Perspectives of Cognitive Science. And Professor Johnson,
okay.
Take it away.
You'll be glad to know that I have a class at 1 o'clock, so we'll be stopping at 12:45 promptly, so I can go talk about race. I don't know why that's a topic, but... Brothers and sisters, a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Have you never read in the Scriptures, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Now, if I remember from my undergraduate class in Life and Teachings of Jesus, the traditional interpretation of this is that Jesus, who was cast out, is going to become the foundation of the kingdom of God. So that's the gospel according to Matthew. Now I have gospel according to John, but not John of the Scriptures, but John Dewey. The stone of aesthetics that was cast out shall become the foundation of our new kingdom, our new philosophy of experience. So says John Dewey, and that's what I'm going to pursue. That aesthetics lies at the heart of our very capacity to make meaning, to have any experience at all, and that when I was in graduate school, I was cast into the nether reaches because I cared about aesthetics. That's what the losers did, and I want to bring it back into the central place as the cornerstone. So that's the gospel according to John. We've got Matthew and John, and now we have the gospel according to Mark. I'm sorry to, please excuse the arrogance. Have you not heard that the aesthetic stone upon which we shall build the new kingdom of philosophy is human meaning that goes beneath language into the depths of our engagement with our world? And so what I'm going to claim is that if you want to understand human meaning and communication and experience, cognition, values, you have to delve deeply into the body and the way the body engages its environment to see how meaning is built up from that. And that this is a profoundly aesthetic undertaking. So that any theory of communication that is going to be workable has to be centrally focused on these kinds of phenomena I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to say the following. Instead of thinking of aesthetics as basically about aesthetic judgment and the nature of beauty and the nature of art, the way it's taught as an academic discipline in philosophy, I'm going to say that aesthetics concerns everything that goes into our ability to have meaning, to experience meaning and significance. And so it involves form and structure, the qualities that define the situations of our lives, our felt sense of the meaning of things, our rhythmic engagement with our surroundings, our emotional interactions, and so forth. So I'm going to say meaning reaches down into the body, and that aesthetics is about all of the ways in which meaning emerges for us. And I'm going to claim that it's important in art. We think of aesthetics and connect it with art because art is an exemplary manifestation of meaning making, and that's why we care about it when we do. So, what I'm claiming is no body, never mind, that mind is embodied. The grounding assumption of embodied cognition theory is that mind, meaning, thought, and value all arise from the ongoing interactions of a bodily organism with its environment. And that environment is at once physical, interpersonal, and cultural. And so everything rests on this, that you start with an organism in ongoing interaction with an environment. And you don't take that as any kind of dualism. That's a fundamental structure, and everything is going to have to come out of that. Consequently, There's no disembodied meaning, no disembodied understanding, no disembodied reasoning. Now, I could drag you through first-generation cognitive science, which was sort of artificial intelligence, information processing psychology, analytic philosophy of mind and language, computational, models, etc. But since the 1970s, there's been a second-generation cognitive science. And George Lakoff and I call this the cognitive science of the embodied mind. The fundamental assumption of this manifestation of cognitive science, this development, is that human beings are embodied human animals, and therefore all our meaning, thinking, and communicative praxis emerge from our visceral engagement with our world. I'm going to stress the visceral. Human mind, thought, and language require a relatively functional brain operating in at least partially functional body, which is in continual interaction with diverse physical, social, and cultural environments. So I'm going to suggest that human being is interactive, transactive, inactive of meaning at a very primitive, basic level, and then it gets elaborated in certain ways. And I'm claiming that the evidence for this comes from second-generation cognitive science, primarily. So, start with a quote from Dewey, from Deweys Gospel. He says, "To see the organism in nature, the nervous system in the organism, the brain in the nervous system, the cortex in the brain, is the answer to the problems which haunt philosophy." Now that drives some of my friends crazy. It's like, come on, give me a break. But this is what I'm going to assume, is that if you want to understand where meaning comes from and how language and communication and value are possible, you've got to see, and the key part here is organism in nature. It's not embedded only in an organism, it's embedded in an organism in ongoing interaction with an environment, that sort of thing. And so Dewey has what he calls a principle of continuity, and it says that you're going to explain, quote, higher cognitive functions and realizations of meaning and value in terms of operations that are organic, biological engagements with an environment. And so from an evolutionary perspective, what you'd say is that we do acceptation, that is, we appropriate sensory, motor, affective, motivational structures of our embodied engagement with our environment for abstract reasoning and thought and communication. So my colleague Don Tucker writes the following, a neuroscientist and psychologist here. The brain evolved to regulate the motivational control of actions, carried out by the motor system, guided by sensory evaluations of ongoing environmental events. So basically, we've got an organism trying to survive and flourish in an environment, and it developed and evolved certain sorts of structures that are crucial for that. There aren't any faculties of memory, conscious perception, or music appreciation. There are no faculties at all, actually, but there are none of this sort that float in a mental ether separate from your bodily functions. That's what embodied cognition is all about. He goes on to say, I wish he wouldn't have said this, but, and he couldn't make it today, but he writes, if we accept that the mind comes from the brain, I'm going to correct that in a minute. The mind comes from the brain, then our behavior and experience must be understood to be elaborations of primordial systems for perceiving, evaluating, and acting. And all I want to correct here is when he says brain, he means the brain in ongoing interaction with environments. It's not locked up only within the brain. You cannot give an adequate account of meaning by only talking about brains. When we study the brain to look for networks controlling cognition, we find that all of the networks that have been implicated in cognition are linked in one way or the other to sensory systems, to motor systems for movement, or to motivational systems. There are no brain parts for disembodied cognition. So that's the basic background for this. So, what do I mean by embodied meaning? My claim is that meaning arises from our bodily and interpersonal interactions with our environments. And when I say something is meaningful, I'm doing this in a pragmatist sense. I'm going to say that the meaning of anything, whether it be an object or an event, and objects are just, as Dewey says, events with meaning. It's all an event ontology. Everything's in process. So to say that something's meaningful is to say that it calls forth in some way experience, either past, present, or future possible experiences. So meaning is relational. It's about how one thing, quality, or event relates to and evokes some other experience. It's cashed out experientially. In short, the meaning of something is what it affords you by way of experience. So this affords pickup ability, drinkability, throwability, and such. So the meaning of that gets cashed out in terms of its, what Gibson called its affordances for us. And I'm not just saying perceptual affordances, but it has social roles, etc. And the water that's in it can be associated with religious rituals of cleansing or whatever. So the affordances are not just physical, sensory affordances. So what we have to understand is that most of the meaning we engage, most of the meaning that goes on, most of the thought that goes on is not conscious and is not accessible by consciousness. Meaning operates within a vast, continuous, non-conscious or marginally conscious process of organism-environment transactions. And it's going to involve images, patterns, qualities, feelings, emotions. Sometimes we conceptually, propositionally develop these meanings, but the big mistake is to take that as though that's what meaning is. And this is the crux of everything I'm saying today. If you take that view, which is the view I learned as a graduate student, and I see pervasive, if you take that the locus of meaning is sentences, language, and all, you will never understand most of what human beings do. You won't understand art, you won't understand ritual practice, you won't understand music experience, you won't understand parts of poetry, you won't understand spontaneous gesture, and on, because these are not propositional in structure. So, let me give you some examples of meaning here. Aw, isn't she cute? My granddaughter. Now, I want to say this is what we all are. This is us. This is what a human being is. A little motion machine. Oh, there's that toe. Oh, she doesn't know it's a toe, but, oh, that's good. Okay. Now watch what she starts to do. It's just this, we're animation, we're life, we're action. And happy action. And the body just is alive. And what I want to say is that this is the beginnings of engagement with the affordances of the world. And that's where meaning's going to come from. Ooh, what's that thingy over there? Okay. Now, I've forgotten how old she was then, but a few months later, you get, here she comes. Ah, yeah, sweetie, how you go, Sophia? Little girl, yeah, okay. So I want to say that is human meaning making. She is learning the affordances of her environment. She's learning how her world becomes possible for her and what it means. In a very primitive way there. But now the world is a world in which you can walk, a world in which you can locomote. It affords you these possibilities. And that is meaning at the most basic level for us. Well, what time are we doing now? What time is it? How many? 20 minutes, okay. So, in a lot of my own work with George Lakoff has been focused on embodied meaning, and I want to give you some examples of this. So think of the ways your body engages its environment. You experience verticality. You experience containers. You experience things moving from a source along a path toward a goal. And you move your own body in that way to achieve purposes. You experience balance and loss of balance. Because of the way our bodies are, we have center and periphery, or center and horizontal character to our experience. And it's the result of the nature of our bodies and the nature of our environments. We have front, back, near, far, iteration. And Lakoff and I called all of these image schemas. And our claim is that this is meaning at the most primitive level. We're picking up on these structures that are meaningful for creatures like us, and they're shared by human beings. Now, the claim is that these can be elaborated culturally so that you get differentiation, but that all around the world, people make use of image schematic structure in their lives. And it shows up in their language and in their symbols, systems, etc. Now, it's a crucial part of our argument that these structures have meanings and have a logic. So, my keys are in my hand. My hand's in my pocket. My pocket's in my pants. My pants are in this room. This room's in this city. This city's in this state. Where are my keys? They're in this state. And I'm saying that, and what do babies learn? They put things in, they take things out, that sort of thing. They're learning the logic of containment. They're actually learning the logic of containment. They can't articulate it, but it grows from that. And so I'm saying that a container structure, a basic container schema, and there are neural ways that these get realized, and I'm not talking about that part today, involves a boundary, an interior and an exterior. And there's a logic to that. If one container is inside another container, and that container is inside another container, then the first container is inside the third container. And that's logically called, there's a transposition from one to the other to the third. So there is an image schematic logic, which is to say there's already a kind of primitive reasoning at the corporeal, bodily, incarnate level for us. So transitivity of containment, the logical relation, is grounded in our experience of bodily containers. Now, how do we get to abstract concepts? Well, I've spent 30 years of my life, it may be embarrassing to say, working on some of this. And one of the ideas we have is that we have basic conceptual metaphors in terms of which we structure our understanding. And these metaphors take a bodily and social source domain, like vision, let's say, and they map it onto a domain that we regard as more abstract. So we get a metaphor, something like understanding is seeing, as in I see what you mean. That was a cloudy argument. Could you shed a little more light on what you mean by conceptual metaphor? And so those metaphors are not accidental, we're claiming. They're not arbitrary because they're motivated profoundly by our bodily engagement with the world and the way our bodies and our environments are structured. And they put us in touch with important aspects of our being. And now we have 30 years of work on this cross-culturally where we can see how these play out in different languages. And two people who are here today are from China, and they actually are working on metaphors and looking at cross-cultural connections of metaphors. So let me give you an example of this. We have a metaphor, we call it affection is warmth. I'm holding a baby, and the baby experiences a kind of correlation between warmth and affection. And we claim that experiences like that provide a bodily basis for a metaphor, what's called a primary metaphor by Joseph Grady. And so I can say, I received a warm reception in Norway. Our relationship has cooled off recently. That's a fundamental metaphor that you find in cultures around the world. Affection is warmth, even in warm cultures. Here's a nice one. Bad is stinky. And there's a lot of work on disgust reactions. And, but so, you know, we're claiming that you evaluate a situation or an object as good or bad in relation to smell, and that becomes the basis for a metaphor. You know, like, so what Johnson just said stinks, or something like that. Okay, so if I had time, which I don't, how much?
No, you do. You've got at least 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. Let me point to this one, and then I'll give you some examples of this. So one of our most basic metaphors is organization as physical structure, because physical structures manifest functional organization. So there's an experiential correlation. And notice, as soon as you get a metaphor structure like this, you can take any physical object and relationships and use that metaphorically to understand abstract reasoning, understanding, inference drawing, etc. So remember the container schemas. A is in B is in C. Well, that can, if you understand categories as metaphorical containers, then you can use category logic for doing Aristotelian syllogisms and such. And so the claim is that we can look at any abstract process, cognitive process, and we'll find metaphors that let us build up the meaning, not top down, but from the bottom up. Okay. Now, I want to give you this example. Ray Gibbs is a psychologist who more than anyone else over the last 30 years has studied the conceptual metaphor from the psychological basis. And this is one of his examples. This is a girl talking, one of his students talking about her boyfriend. She says, back in high school, I had, it should be, this huge crush on this guy, James, who was a total hunk. He would flirt with me when we'd talk, but I didn't get a chance to know him very well. Well, never mind ever be alone with him. I was dying to get closer to him and felt starved for his attention. I walked around for over 5 months feeling silly and empty because I wanted him so bad. I wanted to eat him alive. He was yummy. Now, that was the description. That's what how she described her relation and her feelings about James. And what Gibbs did in this case was, he says, so is there a metaphor of desire is hunger? And what he did was work up people's folk models of hunger, like what are the characteristics of hunger, and then he looked in English and Brazilian Portuguese and some other languages to see if in fact that desire is hunger metaphor actually existed cross-culturally, and it did. Now, our claim isn't that if you find a metaphor in one culture, you're going to find it in another. But some of them are going to be really good candidates for a kind of universality. But that doesn't mean they're going to mean the same thing in each culture, because they're going to be embedded in complexes of meaning. And so they may be different in different cultures. Now, let me end this part by saying, I'm pointing out that metaphor is not just a linguistic device. It's not just a poetic device. It's a fundamental device of our making sense of things. And people did research on spontaneous gestures, and I think this is kind of fascinating. So Dave McNeil at the University of Chicago is one of the founders of this kind of research. And he says, look, there are 3 kinds of gestures. There are beat gestures, and this is my interaction space right here. And the beat gestures tend to take place down here, and they emphasize things. And so you should pay attention to what I'm about to say, that kind of thing. Then there are iconic gestures. And these are gestures in which, I'll give you an example. They showed kids Tweety Bird and Sylvester cartoons. And then they had them describe what they saw. And they say, they do this. They say, now, Sylvester was climbing up the downspout, and Tweety Bird took a bowling ball and dropped it down the downspout and pushed Sylvester out. Now notice, those are iconic gestures. And why do they do this for Sylvester? Because they could do this, but what are they modeling there? The downspout. And why, when they drop the bowling ball, it's not drop the bowling ball, it's drop the bowling ball because that's the bowling ball. And dropped it down from up and all of that. Those are iconic gestures. Now, then there are metaphoric gestures. And so you say, she couldn't decide whether to go out with him. On the one hand, God, he was a hunk. But he was dumb as a stone. And what are you doing? What's the metaphor?
Balancing.
Yeah, weighing. Judging is weighing. And you can see someone do that. And you may think, well, that's in ordinary discourse and all. But McNeil has videotapes he made 20 years ago of mathematicians at the University of Oklahoma looking at complex set theory stuff and complex variables. And he's got them showing all the metaphoric gestures they use to talk about rings and sets and these complexes. If I had more time to talk about it, I would point out one thing, and that is that oftentimes he has cases where what people do with their hand gestures is what they're really trying to get at. What they say is mistaken. So the gestures are not following after. In fact, they usually precede by a few milliseconds the spoken words. And they're not just illustrating them. They have a logic to them. All right. How close are we to the end? 13. There's a lot more, but emotion. So I'm trailing on Antonio Damasio's work on emotion. And I've got some slides here, but let me just sum this up. Damasio says the following. An organism and environment has to maintain a homeostasis. It has to maintain a certain homeostatic balance if it's to live and survive and flourish. So the body has developed automatic mechanisms for doing what? Determining how the body's being affected by its environment and responding accordingly. And he says emotional response patterns are just that. They're automated patterns that run on the basis of our ability to monitor our body states and see what changes need to be made. And then sometimes we actually feel those changes in our body states, and so we say we feel the emotion. All right? That's the basic idea. And what I'm trying to say is that's meaning too. When I was in graduate school, that wasn't meaning. They didn't allow you. They'd say, oh, that's emotive meaning, and then they never talk about it again. And I'm saying, no, what is more meaningful? What could possibly be more meaningful than your body's affective engagement with its environment? Because it is telling you, as I would say, how things are going for you right now. All right, so this is his theory, and I'm cutting to the chase. I'm saying emotions lie at the heart of our ability to make sense of our world and to act intelligently within it. They're a fundamental part of meaning, and if you leave that out, you're not going to understand how meaning operates for us. Okay, so here's what I'm ending with. When the body's taken seriously, then aesthetics gets thrust from the front and center as the starting point of philosophical reflection. Aesthetics concerns everything that goes into the meaning of any situation. Perceptions, images. I didn't talk about qualities because I don't have enough time, but that would be another fundamental part of meaning. Aesthetics, as Dewey noted, is not just about art and aesthetic judgment, but rather about how we experience and make meaning and find significance in our lives. So here's an example of this. And what's so great about this is it's just chock full of meaning, and very little of it is about language. There is meaning about language, but look at all the ways through the body that meaning is expressed here. Oh, go back.
And then just
I got to get.
There you go.
How many minutes?
See you tomorrow.
Good night, Doc. Take care of that throat. You're a big singing star now, remember? This California dew was just a little heavier than usual tonight.
Really? From where I stand, the sun is shining all over the place.
And I want to say the modes of meaning that I learned in graduate school have almost nothing to say about this. And yet everybody picks up on the meaning of this. Through his bodily comportment, the way whether his body's open or closed, his vibrancy, his facial gestures. He's doodly-doo-doo. How could you not be happy? Doodly-doo-doo. Life is great. Now, I'm singing. It just lifts you right up. I'm singing in the rain. Now, what a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. Boom.
I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above, and the sun's in my heart, and I'm ready for love. Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. Come on with the rain, I have a smile on my face.
Okay. Now, I want to say that any theory of meaning and communication and language is going to have to account for that. That's just chock full of meaning. And it cannot do it in terms of propositions and concepts. That's a part of it. But you have to have an understanding of all of these dimensions of bodily meaning. So I'm suggesting that an adequate theory of communication is going to have to be grounded in an adequate account, embodied account of cognition, of meaning, of understanding. I didn't mention values, but they're at the heart of everything that's going on here because the body is a valuing organism. It's chock full of values that determine what can be meaningful to it, what it pursues, etc., and how it does that. So I'm suggesting that we need to open up the resources that we have from second-generation cognitive science if we want an adequate account of human meaning, human understanding, and human reason. Thank you. What time is it now? Okay, good.
We've got 10 minutes for questions, so please open it up to everyone for Q&A.
Anybody?
Oh yes, please, in the corner.
I just wonder how, if at all, your work is being changed by all the meanings being formed through social media. You know, where the body isn't immediately present, and you don't read the body. I just wonder.
No, but no body, never mind. No body, no meaning. So their body is always there,
Yes.
but it's what are the modes of interaction?
Yes.
And this has been my teacher over here for the last several years on trying to bring me up to speed on that. But I want to say, you know, Jer's been the interlocutor for me to say, look at all these technologies that are emerging. How do they structure these embodied modes of engagement? And for good and for ill, you know. And I'm still in a kind of state of naivete about that. But I want to say it's not that there's no embodiment, because there's no meaning, no life without embodiment. It's how does it actually shape, what possibilities does it open up for modes of engagement? How does it bring in affect in certain ways? That's the direction I think this requires inquiry to go.
Please.
You'll have to watch my gestures because I'm not sure we're going to be able to get this across. A fundamental premise here is that meaning, cognition arise from our shared experience
Yes.
of having human bodies.
Yes.
And there's a lot that's intuitively healing about that. And yet, when you look in philosophy, things like mind-body duality are very deeply embedded in how people think.
Yes.
So if it's so wrong and so poorly matched to it arising from bodily experience, how is it that that we can be so deeply embedded in things that are not embedded, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
That is, and it seems to be one of those characteristics of humans and our meaning making is that we can develop systems that have no apparent relationship to reality at all, stunningly so.
Okay, great question. So I want to say two things about this in the time we've got. So I'd start by saying there's a nice book by Drew Lader called The Absent Body. And he's a kind of Merleau-Pontian. He's a doctor, but he's trained as a philosopher. And he shows, like Michael Polanyi did, all of the ways in which the body recedes in acts of perception. So, there's a from-to structure, an intentionality structure of perception. And so I tend not to be focused on the eyes doing the seeing or the muscles operating to move the eyeballs and all of that. I'm not focused on that, and I'm directed out towards something in a perceptual field. And he goes through, the entire book goes through all these ways in which the body seems to recede in our acts of thinking. And so, but it's so that's the paradox there, that it's both, it can't happen without all that bodily stuff going on. And it's not just a seat of it, it shapes the very mode of interaction, and yet we don't experience it that way. But look, I want to say 90% or 95% of our cognitive activity we don't experience. And huge parts of our bodily goings on we do not experience, and some of them we can't experience. So we're just not aware of that. And then we develop these, and here's what's interesting to me. I was trained in all of this dualist stuff, over the centuries, and you see it recurring again and again in cultures around the world. But if you start looking at the concepts people have for thinking, they're all metaphorical. And the metaphors all have as their their source domains, bodily activities, like moving your body, manipulating objects, having sex, etc. There are all these metaphors, and you find them in languages around the world that are actually, it doesn't mean we're aware of it, but the claim is that we're actually activating parts of our cortex, that have to do with vision and bodily movement and that sort of thing when we're understanding these abstractions. And we don't feel that as a consciousness. So I think that dualism is never going to go away. It gets reinforced. It's built into our language at a profound level. When I try to talk about Dewey saying it's always the interaction of an organism and environment, I'm already done, because it was the interaction of an organism and environment as though they're two different things.
Professor Una?
Just a couple of comments. So about social media. Social media is a way to virtually embody, right? So many images convey this aesthetic experience of what it means to be in a person's presence, but it does it virtually. So it's very embodied. Social media is highly embodied, is the comment I want to make. And then in relation to what you said, I think what you just described helps us to give a larger frame of reference for dualistic consciousness. So then if somebody is expositing on something that's highly procedural, disembodied reason, then you can get an aesthetic sense of how that person is embodying disembodied reason. So this kind of framework really gives a much larger frame of reference for understanding dualism within a larger embodied consciousness.
So in a sense, because of how perception works, the experience of disembodiment is a fundamental phenomenology.
Feels, yeah.
It's fundamentally embodied. It's fundamentally embodied.
Yeah.
Please, McCord.
So this might not be a great question, but so the way I understand it is that what you're saying is like everything is kind of scaffolded up from these
That's right.
fundamental interactions we have with the environment. So
That's
just
right.
wondering, like, how does that lead me to an emotion such as guilt? Like, how does...
Well, my last book project was called Morality for Humans. And you can see where I'm going there. We're not little gods, Dewey says. All of our values are going to emerge from what? Patterns of organism-environment interaction, but our environments include other people. So you're going to have to, you can say there are going to be these dimensions of values. We're going to have some values that are critical for our immediate physical survival. Then we're going to have values that emerge from the fact that we're profoundly interpersonal beings in a kind of primary intersubjectivity with one another. And then you're going to have values that emerge at the level of ourselves as interacting in larger communal groups. And you're going to have values that have to do with the fact that we're meaning-making creatures. So I have to tell, I'm not going to do it right now. I mean, I can't just lay this out there, but I'm going to have to tell, on my account, a story of how those levels emerge. And, and then you have to say, here's what guilt means there. Here's the structure of that. And show how it's connected to these, I just described 4 levels of complex interactions.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left. Please.
When looking at conceptual metaphors in media texts, would you say that people attach meaning immediately, or is it the frequency of a certain metaphor that creates that?
Oh, that's a good question too. Yes, both. I mean, they attach meaning immediately. That doesn't mean you know what you're meaning. I mean, it's having that effect on you already. And these metaphors get profoundly embedded and reproduced. So they're not just in text, but they're in advertising, for example. There's a lot of work now on conceptual metaphor in advertising. And then you have it, and so it's like a framing problem. You keep encountering these over and over again, and they become the very mode, of course that's what the phenomenon is, and so in a sense you could say they become for us sort of literalized. But Lakoff and I were saying that's a way to talk about it. That's a way of saying they're deeply embedded and they're generating all of this response on our part and the values, but they're still metaphoric because there's a cross-domain mapping there. So they are what are going to make it possible because you've been trained up through those. They're the possibilities for experiencing a world in a certain way, and when something fits that pattern, it's going to make sense to you. That's the claim.
And it also seems like once we have an operative metaphor, it's not an abstract thing. The metaphor itself is an embodied thought object that now is operating in a physiological way.
Right.
So metaphors themselves have meat.
And yes, they do. And they're not. And so the names of them are not the metaphors. They are actually. So like there's all this work now. If someone says I couldn't get, that was a slippery idea, or we had a rough day. There's a guy Krishna Sathian at Emory who's a neuroscientist, and he's looking at how areas of the brain having to do with touch are activated when you say I had a rough day. And so actually you're embodying roughness in you, when you say I had a rough day. There's a kind of neural activation having to do with areas in both in the motor and premotor cortex and in areas responsible for touch.
Please join me in
I think we're out of
Mr.
time.
Johnson.